Jenna never planned on becoming a rideshare driver. It was a temporary gig, something to keep her afloat while she figured out her next steps in life. But tonight, her route was quiet, the streets nearly deserted under the full moon's pale glow. It was around 2 a.m., and Jenna had just completed her last drop-off in a sleepy suburban neighborhood. She had been ready to call it a night when a ping came through for one more ride. The pickup was in an unfamiliar area, out near the outskirts of town, a place Jenna had rarely driven to. She hesitated for a moment, her finger hovering over the accept button, but the payout was too good to pass up, double the usual rate. Maybe this last ride would be worth it. As she made her way down the narrow, winding road, the houses grew sparser, replaced by thick clusters of trees. The GPS led her deeper into a forested area, the streetlights fading away until there was nothing but her headlights cutting through the darkness. The eerie silence of the place unsettled her, but she kept driving, telling herself it was just another job. Finally, she pulled up to a small clearing where an old, weathered house stood at the edge of the woods. It looked abandoned, the windows dark, the lawn overgrown. But according to her app, this was the right place. Jenna glanced at her phone and double-checked the details. Midnight passenger, it said. No profile picture, no other information. She waited, tapping her fingers nervously on the steering wheel. A few minutes passed, and just as she was about to cancel the ride, she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. A figure emerged from the shadows of the house, walking slowly toward her car. Jenna's stomach tightened with unease. The man was tall, dressed in a long black coat that seemed to blend into the night. His face was hidden under the brim of a wide hat, and something about him felt off. He moved with a deliberate slowness, his footsteps almost too quiet for someone walking on gravel. Jenna's instincts screamed at her to drive away, but she stayed. After all, it was just a passenger, right? She had dealt with all sorts of strange people during her time as a driver. This was no different, or so she thought. The man opened the back door and slid into the seat without a word. The air inside the car seemed to grow colder as soon as he entered, a faint chill creeping up Jenna's spine. She glanced in the rearview mirror, but the brim of his hat cast a shadow over his face, obscuring it completely. "Where to?" Jenna asked, her voice shakier than she intended. The man remained silent for a moment, then spoke in a low, gravelly voice. "Just drive. I'll tell you when to stop." Jenna hesitated. "I need a destination," she said, trying to keep her tone calm. "I'll tell you when to stop," the man repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. The unease settled deeper into her chest, but against her better judgment, she started the car and pulled away from the house. The road stretched out ahead, dark and winding, the trees on either side looming like silent sentinels. For the first few minutes, the ride was eerily quiet. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Jenna's fingers tightened around the steering wheel as she kept glancing in the rearview mirror. The man didn't move, didn't speak, just sat there, his hat casting a deep shadow over his face. Time seemed to stretch on, each minute feeling like an hour. Jenna tried to make small talk, hoping to ease the tension. "So, are you from around here?" The man said nothing. She tried again. "It's a nice night for a drive, huh?" Still, no response. Jenna's heart raced. Something wasn't right. She needed to get out of this situation, but she couldn't just abandon him on the side of the road. Not without a valid reason. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, but the air felt thick and heavy in her lungs. As they drove deeper into the woods, the darkness seemed to close in around them. The trees grew denser, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Jenna's stomach churned with unease, and she could feel the man's presence looming behind her, even though he remained perfectly still. And then, out of nowhere, he spoke. "Turn left." Jenna blinked, her eyes darting to the GPS. There was no left turn on the map, just a narrow dirt path that cut through the forest. I don't think that's a road," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Turn left," the man repeated, his tone colder this time. Jenna swallowed hard and, against her better judgment, veered onto the dirt path. The car bounced along the uneven ground, the headlights barely piercing through the thick underbrush. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to stop, to turn around, but she couldn't. Something about the man's voice compelled her to keep going. The further they drove, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches scraping against the sides of the car like claws. The road became rougher, the bumps jarring Jenna's hands on the steering wheel. Her heart pounded in her chest and she kept glancing in the rearview mirror, but the man remained silent, his face still hidden in shadow. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man spoke again. "Stop here." Jenna slammed on the brakes, her breath coming in short gasps. They had reached a clearing, surrounded by towering trees that blocked out the moonlight. The air was thick with an eerie stillness, the kind that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She turned to face the man, her voice shaky. "What now?" For the first time, the man moved. Slowly, he reached up and removed his hat, revealing a face that was gaunt and pale, his eyes hollow and dark. A cold, twisted smile spread across his lips as he met Jenna's terrified gaze. "Thank you for the ride," he said softly. Jenna's heart stopped. Jenna froze, her breath caught in her throat as the man's smile widened. There was something sinister about him, something otherworldly, and it made every fiber of her being scream to get away. The temperature inside the car seemed to drop even further as he slowly opened the door, stepping out into the mist-covered clearing. She quickly averted her gaze from his face, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread as the man stood there, his presence almost suffocating. He didn't move immediately but lingered as if savoring the tension in the air. The wind outside rustled through the trees, carrying with it a faint whisper that Jenna couldn't quite make out. After what felt like hours, he finally spoke. "You've taken me far enough." Jenna swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. "You didn't tell me where we were going," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. The man turned slightly, his gaunt face still partially obscured by shadow. His smile was gone, replaced by an expression of unsettling calm. "I never said I was going anywhere," he replied cryptically. Jenna's heart raced. She needed to leave. Now every instinct told her that something terrible was about to happen if she stayed any longer. Without another word, she shifted the car into gear and began to pull away from the clearing. But before she could even drive a few feet, the engine sputtered and died. Panic surged through her as she frantically turned the key, but the car wouldn't start. She tried again, her hands trembling, but the engine remained silent, the headlights flickering out, leaving her in total darkness. The man stood motionless outside, watching her with those cold, empty eyes. Jenna's heart pounded in her chest as she realized she was trapped. She fumbled for her phone, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. They were too deep in the woods. Desperation clawed at her insides as she tried to come up with a plan. She couldn't stay here, not with him. But the road back was long, and she didn't know how far she'd have to walk before finding help, if there was any help out here at all. The man took a step closer to the car, and Jenna's breath hitched in her throat. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. His eyes never left hers, and for the first time she could see the cold malevolence that lay behind them. "I need to go," Jenna muttered to herself, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. She yanked the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The locks had somehow engaged on their own, trapping her inside the car. Panic turned to terror as she realized she had no way out. The man was now standing right beside the driver's window, his face just inches from the glass. Jenna recoiled in her seat, her back pressing against the door on the other side of the car. His pale hand slowly reached out, tapping the window with his long, bony fingers. "Let me out." Jenna's voice was a desperate whisper. "Please." The man's lips curled into that same twisted smile. "You've already brought me to where I belong," he said softly. "Now it's time for you to stay." Jenna's mind raced, her thoughts a blur of fear and confusion. What did he mean by that? Why was this happening to her? She had just been doing her job, picking up a stranger like any other night, and now she was caught in some nightmare that didn't make any sense. The man's hand slid down the window, leaving a cold trail of condensation on the glass. He turned away, walking back toward the darkness of the forest. Jenna watched him, her breath shaky, as he disappeared into the thick fog. For a brief moment, she thought he was gone. Maybe he was just some creepy drifter playing a sick joke. But then she heard the voice again. "You can't leave." Jenna's blood turned to ice as she looked in the rearview mirror. The man was sitting in the back seat of the car again, even though she hadn't heard the door open. He was just there, like he had materialized out of the air itself. Her heart hammered in her chest as she scrambled to unlock the door, her fingers trembling uncontrollably. She had to get out. She had to run. But the locks wouldn't budge no matter how hard she tried. The man leaned forward, his breath cold against the back of her neck. "This is where it ends," he whispered. Jenna's mind raced as she frantically searched for a way out. She couldn't stay in the car. She had to escape before it was too late. Without thinking, she slammed her elbow into the window, desperate to break the glass. But it didn't even crack. Tears welled up in her eyes as she turned to face the man in the back seat. His eyes were dark, his face devoid of any emotion. He leaned forward, his cold fingers brushing against her shoulder. "You can't escape," he whispered, his voice sending chills down her spine. Jenna's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she yanked at the door handle again, praying it would open this time. But the lock held firm, trapping her inside with the man who seemed to defy all logic, all reality. Suddenly, the man reached out and grabbed her wrist with a grip that was impossibly strong. His touch was freezing, and it sent a jolt of pain through her arm. "You were chosen," he said, his voice low and cold. "You belong to this place now." Jenna let out a scream, yanking her arm away from him with all her strength. She managed to break free from his grasp, her heart racing as she searched for anything she could use to defend herself. The car felt like a coffin, trapping her in this nightmare with no way out. The man didn't move from his seat, but his presence seemed to grow more overwhelming, as if the very air inside the car was being sucked away. Jenna's vision blurred as panic set in, her mind reeling with fear and desperation. She reached for her phone, her hands shaking so badly that she could barely hold it. She tried dialing 911, but the call wouldn't go through. No service. Of course there wasn't. They were too far from any help. "Please," Jenna whimpered, her voice barely audible. "I just want to go home." The man's eyes bore into hers, cold and empty. "This is your home now." Jenna's heart dropped as those words sunk in. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't let him take her. Without thinking, she slammed her fist into the dashboard, hoping to trigger the car's emergency systems. But nothing happened. She had to make a choice. Stay and face whatever horror the man had planned, or risk running into the dark, unfamiliar woods in the dead of night. In a split-second decision, Jenna threw herself against the door, using all her weight to try to break it open. To her shock, it finally gave way, and she tumbled out of the car, hitting the cold, damp ground with a painful thud. She scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding in her chest as she glanced back at the car. The man was still inside, watching her with that same eerie calm. But she didn't wait to see what he would do next. Without a second thought, Jenna took off into the woods, her feet pounding against the soft, wet earth as she ran for her life. The darkness swallowed her whole, the trees closing in around her as she fled deeper into the forest. Behind her, she could hear the man's voice, low and chilling, calling her name. "You can't escape." Jenna's lungs burned as she raced through the thick undergrowth, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The damp leaves and mud made every step treacherous, but she couldn't stop. She could still hear his voice, that chilling whisper calling her name, echoing in the distance. The forest was dense, and every shadow seemed to twist into something sinister. The rain picked up again, its steady rhythm drumming against the treetops, making it even harder to see. Jenna's clothes were soaked through, her body shivering uncontrollably from the cold, but she forced herself to keep running. Every now and then she would glance over her shoulder, half expecting to see the man behind her, but there was only darkness. The forest floor was uneven, riddled with roots and fallen branches, and it wasn't long before she tripped. Jenna hit the ground hard, her ankle twisting painfully beneath her. She cried out, clutching her leg as tears welled in her eyes. For a moment, she lay there, the rain pouring down on her, mixing with her tears, wondering if she had made a mistake. Running into the woods had seemed like the only option, but now it felt like she had just doomed herself further. The pain in her ankle throbbed, but there was no time to wallow in it. She could still hear his voice, faint but persistent, and it was getting closer. "You can't escape." With a groan, Jenna pushed herself up, trying to put weight on her injured ankle. A sharp jolt of pain shot through her leg, but she gritted her teeth and hobbled forward. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. The forest felt endless, a maze of trees and shadows that all looked the same. Every direction felt like the wrong one. As she limped through the woods, Jenna became hyper-aware of every sound. The crackling of leaves beneath her feet, the soft rustle of branches overhead, and the occasional snap of a twig that sent her heart racing. Was it him? Or was it just the forest playing tricks on her mind? Her phone was still in her hand, but it was useless out here. She tried one more time to call for help, but the screen only displayed the dreaded "no service." Frustration bubbled up inside her, and she shoved the phone back into her pocket. She was on her own. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees towering above like silent sentinels. Every now and then she thought she saw something move in the corner of her eye, an unnaturally dark shape slipping between the trees. But when she turned to look, there was nothing there, just shadows. Jenna's heart pounded in her chest, the adrenaline keeping her going despite the pain. But deep down she knew she couldn't keep this up forever. She had to find shelter, a place to hide, somewhere the man couldn't reach her. But where? There was nothing but endless trees and the relentless rain. Then up ahead, she spotted something. A faint glow between the trees, barely visible through the sheets of rain. Hope surged through her and she quickened her pace, ignoring the pain in her ankle. It was a light. A cabin, maybe. A house. Anything was better than the open forest. She could hide, call for help, and figure out what to do next. As Jenna drew closer, the light became clearer. It was a small, run-down cabin nestled among the trees, its windows glowing with a soft, flickering light. Relief washed over her and she hobbled toward it, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. But as she approached, something made her stop. The cabin looked old, too old, like it hadn't been lived in for years. The wood was rotting, the windows covered in grime, and yet the light inside flickered warmly, inviting her in. Jenna hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. But what choice did she have? She was alone, injured, and being hunted by a man who seemed to defy the laws of reality. She needed shelter, and this was the only place for miles. With a deep breath, she limped up to the front door. The wood creaked ominously beneath her weight, and the air around the cabin was thick with an unnatural stillness. Jenna raised her hand to knock, but the door swung open on its own, revealing the dimly lit interior. Inside, the cabin was sparse. A single chair sat in the center of the room, facing an old fireplace that crackled with a weak flame. Dust covered every surface, and the air smelled musty, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. Jenna stepped inside cautiously, her footsteps echoing in the quiet. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Is anyone here?" There was no answer. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire. Jenna's unease grew as she looked around. Something wasn't right. Why was the fire still burning in such an abandoned place? Who had lit it? She moved further into the cabin, her eyes scanning every corner for any sign of life. But there was nothing. No food, no belongings, no sign that anyone had been here in years. And yet the fire flickered as if it had just been started. Jenna's heart raced as a cold realization crept over her. She wasn't alone. Someone, or something, was watching her. Suddenly, the door behind her slammed shut with a deafening bang. Jenna jumped, her pulse skyrocketing as she spun around. The door was shut tight, and the room seemed darker now, the light from the fire casting eerie shadows on the walls. Her breath quickened as she backed away from the door, her eyes darting around the cabin. The oppressive silence pressed down on her, making it hard to think. She was trapped, just like she had been in the car, only now there was no way out. And then she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper that sent chills down her spine. "You can't run forever." Jenna's blood ran cold. The voice was inside the cabin, closer now, and it wasn't coming from the man outside. Something else was here, something that had been waiting for her. She backed away slowly, her eyes wide with terror. The whispering grew louder, filling the room with its eerie cadence. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, all at once. "You belong here." Jenna's legs gave out, and she collapsed onto the floor, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The shadows on the walls twisted and writhed, moving in unnatural patterns as the fire flickered wildly. And then, from the darkness of the far corner, a figure emerged. It wasn't the man. It was something much worse. Jenna's breath hitched as the figure stepped out from the shadows, its form barely discernible in the dim light. It was tall, much taller than any human should be, with limbs that were too long and a body that seemed to stretch and contort as it moved. Its face... Jenna couldn't see its face, only a dark, shifting void where its features should have been. It stood there, silently watching her, its presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, as if the very walls of the cabin were alive with malevolent intent. Jenna scrambled backward, her heart racing, her mind screaming at her to get up and run, but her body wouldn't cooperate. The figure moved closer, its movements unnaturally slow, almost deliberate, as if it was savoring her fear. "You can't leave." The whisper echoed in her mind, louder now, drowning out all other thoughts. Jenna tried to push herself up, but her legs wouldn't respond. She felt frozen, as if the very air around her had thickened, trapping her in place. The dark figure moved closer, its presence suffocating, a thick, oppressive weight pressing down on her chest. The shadows twisted around it, warping in ways that defied logic. Her eyes darted around the cabin, searching for something, anything, that could help her. But the room had transformed. The walls were no longer wooden, but instead seemed to pulsate, alive with dark, shifting energy. The fireplace, once a warm flicker of light, now burned with an eerie, cold flame, casting long, menacing shadows. The figure was only a few feet away now, towering over her, its long, unnatural limbs reaching out. Jenna's pulse quickened, her breath shallow and ragged. She wanted to scream, but the words stuck in her throat. All she could do was watch in horror as the void where its face should have been drew closer. And then, in an instant, the room fell silent. The whispering stopped. The figure halted its advance, its dark form standing still as a statue. Jenna could feel its gaze on her, though it had no eyes, and for a brief, fleeting moment, she thought it might let her go. But then it spoke again. This time the voice wasn't a whisper. It was a deep, guttural sound, reverberating through the room like the growl of something ancient and unspeakably evil. "You belong to us." Jenna's heart seized in her chest. The words weren't a threat. They were a sentence, a final declaration of her fate. The figure reached out, its long, spindly fingers brushing against her skin, cold as death. The touch was unbearable. A wave of pain surged through her, like fire and ice tearing through her veins. Jenna screamed, her voice piercing the silence, but it didn't matter. No one was there to hear her. No one could save her. Her vision blurred, the cabin fading away into darkness as the figure's grip tightened around her. She could feel her body being pulled, not just physically, but something deeper. Her very soul was being drawn into the void. For a moment, everything went black. When Jenna woke, she was no longer in the cabin. The rain had stopped, and the oppressive weight that had crushed her chest was gone. She was lying on the cold, hard ground, the night sky stretching endlessly above her. For a moment, she thought it had all been a nightmare, a twisted figment of her imagination brought on by the storm. But as she pushed herself up, wincing at the pain in her ankle, she realized something was horribly wrong. The world around her was different. The trees were taller, darker, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes. The air was thick with an eerie silence, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. She stood slowly, her body aching from the ordeal. The cabin was gone, there was no trace of it, no sign that it had ever existed. But Jenna knew it had been real. The pain in her chest, the lingering terror in her mind, they were proof of what had happened. She looked down at her hands, expecting to see the marks left by the figure's touch, but instead her skin was smooth, unblemished. It was as if the encounter had never occurred, as if she had imagined the whole thing, but Jenna knew better. The figure's voice still echoed in her mind, that deep, guttural growl that had promised her soul to something far worse than death. And even though the cabin was gone, the fear remained, gnawing at the edges of her sanity. She had escaped, but not completely. The rain had stopped, but the air was still cold. Jenna limped through the forest, her eyes scanning the shadows, half expecting the figure to reappear at any moment. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving, had to put as much distance between herself and the place where she had nearly lost everything. The night seemed endless, the trees stretching on forever. And with every step, Jenna couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her, lurking just beyond the edge of her vision. She didn't know how long she walked, but eventually, the forest began to thin. The trees gave way to a narrow dirt road, and in the distance she could see the faint glow of streetlights. Civilization, safety. Jenna quickened her pace, hobbling down the road, her heart pounding in her chest. She was almost there, almost free. But as she approached the lights, a strange sensation washed over her. It was subtle at first, a tingling at the back of her neck, a sense of unease that made her stomach twist. And then she heard it, a whisper. "You can't run." Jenna froze, her blood turning to ice. The voice was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. She spun around, her eyes wide with terror, scanning the dark road behind her. But there was nothing, no figure, no shadows. Just the empty night. Her heart raced, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She shook her head, trying to convince herself that it was all in her mind, that she was imagining things. But deep down, Jenna knew the truth. The figure had let her go, but it wasn't finished with her. Not yet. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, echoing in her mind like a twisted lullaby. Jenna's legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed to the ground, clutching her head as the voice filled her mind, drowning out all reason. "You belong to us." The last thing Jenna saw before the darkness consumed her was the shadowy figure standing at the edge of the road, watching her with its faceless void. And then, everything went black. Days passed and Jenna never made it home. Her car was found abandoned by the side of the road, but there was no trace of her. The police searched the forest, combing through every inch of the woods where she had last been seen, but they found nothing. Her disappearance became yet another unsolved mystery, a name on a growing list of people who had vanished without a trace in that cursed stretch of forest. Some said the woods were haunted. Others whispered of dark rituals and ancient evils that lurked within. But those who knew the truth, those who had seen the figure, heard its whispers, knew that Jenna was just the latest victim of something far older and far more terrifying than any ghost story. And somewhere in the darkness of the forest, the figure waits. It waits for the next soul to stumble into its domain, to fall into its trap. Because once it has marked you, there is no escape. Lauren was excited about her new apartment. It was a quaint one-bedroom unit in a quiet neighborhood far from the noise of the city. She had saved for months to afford the place, and now that she was finally moving in, it felt like the start of a new chapter in her life. The apartment had large windows that let in the natural light, and from her living room, she could see a small park across the street where children often played during the day. The evenings were peaceful, and the distant sound of birds chirping made the place feel serene. It was perfect. At first, everything seemed normal. Lauren spent her days working from home and her evenings unpacking boxes and making the apartment feel like her own. She hung up pictures, arranged her furniture, and bought some plants to brighten the space. The neighbors were friendly, and everything about the place seemed ideal. But after the first few nights, she started noticing something strange. Every evening as the sun began to set, she felt like someone was watching her. It was a creeping sensation, subtle at first, but impossible to ignore. Whenever she glanced out the window, she saw nothing unusual, just the park and the empty streets as the night grew darker. Still, the feeling persisted, growing stronger each night. It became harder to shake the sensation that someone, or something, was observing her. She dismissed it at first, chalking it up to nerves about living alone for the first time. But soon it became impossible to ignore. One evening, as Lauren was settling in for the night, she heard a soft tapping sound. It was faint, barely noticeable at first, but it caught her attention. She looked toward the window, but there was nothing there. The tapping continued, irregular but constant, like something gently knocking against the glass. Her heart raced. She walked to the window and pulled the curtains aside. The park was empty, bathed in the dim glow of streetlights, and the street was silent. Nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling of being watched intensified. She stood there for a moment, scanning the area, but there was no movement, no sign of anyone around. She closed the curtains, trying to shake off the unease, but the tapping didn't stop. It was coming from the window in her bedroom now, the sound slightly louder, more insistent. Fear crept into her chest, and she hesitated before approaching the window again. This time she didn't look outside. She pulled the curtains closed tightly and hurried back to the living room, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. The next morning, Lauren tried to brush off the events of the previous night. She had work to do, and there was no sense in worrying over something that was probably just a figment of her imagination. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It lingered, like a dark cloud hanging over her, making it difficult to concentrate. That evening, as she sat in the living room trying to relax with a book, she heard the tapping again. This time it was louder, more deliberate. Her stomach tightened with fear. She didn't want to look, but she couldn't ignore it. The sound was coming from the living room window now, the same window she had looked through countless times during the day. Slowly, she stood up and walked to the window. Her hand trembled as she reached for the curtain. She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. What if someone was out there? What if the thing she had feared all along was real? With a deep breath, she pulled the curtain aside. Nothing. The street was empty. The park was still. But the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Suddenly, a shadow moved at the edge of her vision. It was quick, just a flicker, but enough to make her gasp. She looked again, but whatever it was had disappeared. Her heart raced as she backed away from the window. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been standing there, just out of sight, watching her. That night, Lauren locked every window and door in the apartment, double-checking each one before going to bed. She tried to sleep, but every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside, sent her mind racing. She felt vulnerable, exposed. She wasn't alone, even though the apartment was empty. Hours passed, and Lauren finally drifted off into a restless sleep. But her dreams were filled with shadows, and in every corner she felt eyes on her, watching her every move. Days passed, and the feeling of being watched became unbearable. Lauren started avoiding the windows, keeping the curtains closed at all times. She even rearranged her furniture so that she didn't have to sit facing the windows. But no matter what she did, the presence felt stronger, more oppressive. One night, as she lay in bed, she heard a new sound, a low, scraping noise coming from the hallway. It was faint, almost like the sound of someone dragging something along the floor. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. The sound grew louder, closer, until it seemed to stop just outside her bedroom door. Lauren froze. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she listened, straining to hear any movement. The scraping noise had stopped, but now there was a soft shuffling like footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps right outside her door. She didn't dare move. Her eyes were locked on the door, waiting for it to open. But it didn't. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then the doorknob began to turn. Lauren's blood ran cold. She scrambled out of bed and grabbed her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed the police. The doorknob continued to turn slowly, as if whoever or whatever was on the other side was toying with her, savoring her fear. The operator picked up and Lauren whispered frantically into the phone, explaining that someone was in her apartment. The operator assured her that help was on the way, but it felt like an eternity as she waited, clutching her phone like a lifeline. The doorknob stopped turning, and the silence that followed was deafening. Lauren sat on the floor, her back against the wall, her eyes glued to the door. Minutes passed, and still nothing happened. She could hear the faint sound of sirens in the distance, but the presence outside her door remained. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the front door. The police had arrived. Lauren ran to the door and opened it, her heart racing. The officers swept through the apartment, checking every room, every corner, but they found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no evidence of anyone else being there. The only thing out of place was the doorknob on her bedroom door. It had been twisted so forcefully that it was nearly broken. Despite the police finding no sign of an intruder, Lauren couldn't shake the feeling that she was in danger. She had the locks changed the next day and installed security cameras outside her apartment, but the presence lingered. A week later, she was reviewing the footage from the cameras, hoping to find some explanation for the strange occurrences. For days, there was nothing unusual, just the normal comings and goings of the neighbors and passers-by. But then, late one night, she saw something that made her blood run cold. At exactly 3 a.m., the camera outside her apartment door captured a figure. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a dark coat. His face was obscured by the shadow of his hood, but his posture was unnerving. He stood completely still, facing her door, as if waiting for something. Lauren's heart raced as she watched the footage. The man didn't move for several minutes. He just stood there staring at the door. Then, without warning, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the hallway. She rewound the footage and watched it again, trying to make sense of what she had seen. Who was this man? And why was he standing outside her apartment in the middle of the night? Lauren called the police again, showing them the footage. But without a clear view of the man's face, there wasn't much they could do. They promised to increase patrols in the area, but Lauren knew that wouldn't be enough. She was being watched, and whoever it was, they weren't going to stop. One night, Lauren decided she couldn't take it anymore. She had been living in fear for weeks, and the anxiety was taking its toll. She barely slept, her appetite was gone, and she jumped at every little noise. She needed to get out of the apartment, even if just for a night. She packed a small bag and booked a room at a nearby hotel, hoping to get some rest and clear her mind. The hotel was quiet, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of relief. But that night, as she lay in the unfamiliar bed, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. Tap, tap, tap. the sound of tapping on the window. Lauren's heart raced as she sat up in bed. She was on the 5th floor. There was no way anyone could be tapping on the window. But the sound continued, growing louder, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. With trembling hands, she pulled back the curtain. Standing on the balcony, just outside her window, was the man from the footage. His hood was pulled up, obscuring his face, but she could see the glint of his eyes watching her. Lauren's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the figure outside her window. She felt paralyzed, the blood draining from her face as fear washed over her. How had he found her here? She was miles away from her apartment, in a secure building. There was no way he could have followed her, or so she thought. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, as if the man was daring her to open the window, daring her to let him in. Her heart pounded so loudly in her chest that it drowned out every other sound. She stumbled back from the window, grabbing her phone with trembling hands. Dialing the police once more, she tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She could barely form a coherent sentence, her voice shaking with fear. "The man, he's here," she whispered frantically. "At my window. 5th floor." The operator's calm voice was distant, a background hum against the terror consuming her. They assured her help was on the way, but Lauren knew it would be too late. The man hadn't come this far to be scared off by the police. Her eyes flicked back to the window and her heart nearly stopped when she saw the figure was gone. The balcony was empty. He had vanished into the night, as silently as he had appeared. But Lauren knew he wasn't gone for good. He was still out there lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Moments later, there was a knock at the door. Lauren's blood ran cold. She stood frozen in the center of the room, staring at the door as the knock came again, louder this time. Knock, knock, knock. Her mind raced. Was it the police? Or was it him? Had he found a way into the building? Slowly, cautiously, Lauren approached the door. She peered through the peephole, her breath catching in her throat when she saw 2 police officers standing outside. Relief washed over her as she quickly unlocked the door and let them in. "I saw him," she blurted out, her voice trembling. "He was at my window tapping. He's been following me." The officers exchanged glances, then one of them spoke. "We've checked the security footage, ma'am. No one was captured on camera near your room or the balcony." "Are you sure?" "I'm not imagining it," Lauren interrupted, her fear turning to frustration. "He's been following me for weeks. He's been watching me in my apartment and now here. Please, you have to believe me." The officers gave her a sympathetic look, but insisted they found no evidence of anyone near her window. They assured her they would patrol the area and check for any signs of forced entry. But deep down, Lauren knew the man was too clever for that. He was always one step ahead. After the police left, Lauren sat in silence, her heart still racing. She couldn't stay in the hotel any longer. She had to leave the city, maybe even change her identity. Anything to escape the man who had been tormenting her. But as she packed her things, the sense of being watched returned. Her skin prickled, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She slowly turned toward the window again, dreading what she might see. This time, there was no figure standing on the balcony. But in the darkness just beyond the glass, she could make out a faint message scrawled on the window, written in what looked like condensation. "I see you." Lauren's mind spiraled into panic. This wasn't over. It would never be over. The man would never stop until he had her. In a frenzy, she grabbed her bag and rushed out of the hotel room, determined to leave the city before it was too late. But as she stepped into the hallway, her worst fear came true. The man was standing at the end of the corridor, his hood pulled low over his face, his eyes locked on hers. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Neither of them moved, the silence in the hallway deafening. Then, in a flash, the man took a step toward her. Lauren bolted, her heart hammering in her chest as she ran down the hallway and toward the emergency exit. Her legs burned, her breath came in ragged gasps, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. She could hear his footsteps behind her, slow and methodical, as if he knew he didn't have to rush. He was going to catch her, no matter what. She burst through the door to the stairwell, sprinting down the stairs as fast as she could. The sound of the man's footsteps echoed in the stairwell, growing louder with every passing second. Just as she reached the bottom of the stairs, she saw the exit door ahead. Freedom was only a few steps away, but as she reached for the handle, a hand grabbed her shoulder, pulling her back. Lauren screamed, thrashing wildly as she tried to break free. But the man's grip was too strong. He spun her around, his hooded face inches from hers. For the first time, she saw his eyes, cold, dark, and filled with an unnatural malice. "Why are you doing this?" she sobbed, her voice barely above a whisper. The man said nothing. He only smiled, a slow, sinister smile that chilled her to the bone. In that moment, Lauren knew there was no escape. The man had been watching her for weeks, stalking her every move, and now he had finally caught her. There was no one coming to save her. With one final scream, Lauren fought back with all her strength, but it was no use. The man's grip tightened, and everything went black. Weeks later, the news of Lauren's disappearance made headlines. The police found her abandoned car near a rural area outside the city, but there was no trace of her. The hotel footage showed her running in fear, but the figure who had followed her remained elusive, never caught on camera. The authorities declared it a missing persons case, but those who knew Lauren believed something far darker had happened. And somewhere, in the dead of night, the man who had watched her for so long continued his silent hunt, looking for his next victim. It was a cold, moonless night when Peter first noticed something strange. He lived alone in an isolated cabin deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. The air was eerily still, and the silence that enveloped the forest was unsettling. The only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind, but that night, something else stirred outside his cabin. Peter had always been a light sleeper, and that night, he woke up with a start. The clock by his bedside read 3:12 a.m. His throat felt dry, so he got up to get some water from the kitchen. As he poured himself a glass, his eyes drifted to the window, and that's when he saw it. A shadowy figure standing at the edge of the tree line. At first, Peter thought it was his mind playing tricks on him, but as he blinked and stared harder, the figure didn't disappear. It was tall, with unnaturally long limbs, and it was completely still, facing his cabin. His heart raced. Who would be out here at this hour? And in the middle of the woods? He quickly closed the blinds, his hands trembling. His mind raced with questions. What was that thing? Should he go out and investigate? Or should he lock his doors and pretend it wasn't there? The eerie sensation that something, or someone, was watching him lingered in the air. He spent the rest of the night wide awake, his mind replaying the image of the figure over and over again. By morning, he convinced himself that it must have been a trick of the moonlight, but deep down, he knew something was off. Days passed without incident. Peter tried to shake off the unsettling feeling from that night. But then something even more disturbing happened. It was around midnight when Peter heard the faint sound of footsteps. At first, he thought it was an animal, maybe a deer wandering through the woods. But as the sound got closer, he realized that it wasn't an animal at all. It was a slow, deliberate stride, almost as if someone was circling the cabin. Peter grabbed his flashlight and cautiously opened the door. The cold night air hit him, and as he stepped outside, his heart nearly stopped. There were footprints. Large, human-like footprints, pressed deeply into the mud around his cabin. They circled the perimeter of his home, as though someone had been walking around and around. His hands trembled as he followed the trail, but it seemed to vanish into the forest. There was no sign of anyone or anything, but the prints were fresh. Whoever or whatever had been there had just left. Peter hurried back inside and locked the doors. He spent the next few hours pacing, trying to make sense of it. Was someone messing with him? But who would travel this far into the woods just to scare him? And why now? He tried to sleep, but every creak and gust of wind made him jump. By 3 a.m. he heard the footsteps again, but this time they were right outside his window. His blood ran cold. He sat frozen in bed, too terrified to move. And then, a knock. It was soft at first, but it grew louder, more insistent. Someone or something was knocking on his window. Peter didn't dare to look. He sat there, heart pounding, waiting for it to stop. After what felt like hours, the knocking finally ceased. But sleep was impossible after that. A week later, Peter couldn't take the anxiety any longer. He called his friend Marcus, who lived in town, and asked him to come over. He needed company, someone to help him figure out what was going on. When Marcus arrived, Peter felt a wave of relief. They spent the day trying to track down the source of the footprints, but there was nothing. No signs of anyone in the woods, no broken branches or disturbed foliage. It was as if the figure had appeared and disappeared into thin air. That night, the two friends sat by the fireplace, drinking coffee and trying to come up with logical explanations for what Peter had experienced. But as the clock struck midnight, the atmosphere shifted. The wind outside picked up, howling through the trees, and then they heard it. Footsteps. This time they were louder, more purposeful, as if whoever was outside wasn't afraid of being heard. Peter and Marcus exchanged nervous glances. Marcus, trying to play it cool, grabbed a baseball bat from beside the door. "I'll check it out," he said, but Peter stopped him. "No," Peter whispered. "It's not safe." But Marcus didn't listen. He opened the door and stepped out into the night. Peter watched, his heart racing as Marcus disappeared into the darkness. A minute passed, then 2, then 5. Peter's heart was in his throat. He was about to go after Marcus when he heard a blood-curdling scream. Without thinking, Peter rushed outside, flashlight in hand, calling Marcus's name. But when he reached the spot where the scream had come from, all he found was Marcus's flashlight lying in the mud, flickering weakly. There was no sign of his friend. After Marcus's disappearance, Peter became desperate. He reported the incident to the local authorities, but they found no trace of Marcus, and after a brief investigation, they ruled it as a possible animal attack, though Peter knew better. The nights grew colder, and the footsteps outside the cabin became more frequent. The figure at the edge of the woods returned, closer now, standing just beyond the tree line. Peter knew it was watching him, waiting for something, but he didn't know what. He started seeing the figure in his dreams, tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through his soul. In his nightmares, it would stand at his window, staring in, tapping its long, bony fingers against the glass. Sometimes, it would whisper his name. Peter became a prisoner in his own home, too afraid to leave, too afraid to stay. He boarded up the windows, hoping it would keep the figure out, but the footsteps never stopped. They grew louder, more insistent, and the knocking on the window returned. One night, the knocking turned into pounding, and Peter, terrified beyond belief, shouted, "What do you want?" For the first time, there was an answer. A raspy voice from the other side of the door whispered, "Let me in." Peter's heart pounded in his chest as the raspy voice whispered through the door, "Let me in." He stood frozen, unsure whether to respond. Who or what was on the other side? His pulse throbbed in his ears as he stared at the door, now illuminated by his flickering flashlight. The pounding continued, more aggressive now, as if the entity outside was growing impatient. Peter's thoughts raced. Should he confront it? Should he run? The sense of dread was overwhelming, suffocating him. He knew he couldn't open that door. Whatever was out there had been tormenting him for weeks. If he let it in, there would be no going back. "Go away," Peter shouted, his voice cracking with fear. But the pounding didn't stop. His mind spiraled, desperate for a solution. The memories of Marcus's scream haunted him. Where was his friend? What had happened that night? Deep down, Peter knew the answer, but he refused to acknowledge it. If he did, He would have to face the horrifying reality that the figure wasn't just watching him, it was hunting him. Suddenly, the pounding ceased. Silence fell, and for a moment, Peter thought it might be over. But then, he heard something far worse, a creaking sound, slow and deliberate. It was coming from the back of the cabin. Peter grabbed a knife from the kitchen counter, his hands trembling. He tiptoed toward the sound, praying it was his imagination, but deep down, he knew the figure was inside. It had found another way in. His breath quickened as he rounded the corner, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There, standing in the hallway, was the figure. Its silhouette was grotesque, its limbs unnaturally long, and its face was a horrifying mask of hollow eyes and a gaping mouth. Peter stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. His throat went dry as the figure began to move, slowly advancing toward him, its feet dragging across the floor. It didn't speak this time. Its presence was enough to send waves of terror crashing over Peter. "What do you want?" Peter screamed, holding the knife out in front of him. His voice echoed through the cabin, but the figure said nothing. It just kept moving closer. Peter's instincts kicked in. He bolted toward the front door, fumbling with the locks as panic surged through him. Just as he yanked the door open, a freezing hand clamped down on his shoulder. The grip was impossibly strong, and Peter felt a cold chill seep into his skin. He whipped around, slashing with the knife, but the figure was gone. Peter stood there panting, his heart racing. The door was wide open and the night air blew in, chilling him to the bone. He slammed the door shut and locked it again, backing away into the living room, his mind racing. Peter sat in his living room, staring blankly at the boarded-up windows. The figure had disappeared again, but he knew it wasn't gone. It was toying with him, testing his resolve, waiting for the right moment to strike. But what did it want? Exhaustion overtook him, and despite his fear, Peter's eyes began to droop. He drifted off into a fitful sleep, but his dreams offered no respite. In his nightmare, Peter found himself back in the woods, searching for Marcus. The trees loomed high above him, casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. The air was thick with an unnatural fog, and the sounds of the forest were eerily silent. Then, he saw it, the figure, standing at the edge of the woods. But this time, it wasn't alone. There was another figure beside it, smaller, familiar. It was Marcus. His friend's face was pale, his eyes wide with terror, but he didn't move. He just stood there, as if waiting for something. Peter tried to call out to him, but no sound escaped his lips. The figure raised its hand, and with a single motion, Marcus collapsed to the ground, his body dissolving into the fog. Peter jolted awake, his heart hammering in his chest. He was drenched in sweat, and the faint glow of dawn was beginning to seep through the cracks in the boards covering the windows. Suddenly, a sharp knock on the door echoed through the cabin. Peter froze. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was too early, no one should be here. Slowly, he rose from his chair and approached the door, his heart pounding. "Who is it?" he called out, his voice barely a whisper. There was no response. His hand shook as he reached for the doorknob. With a deep breath, he yanked the door open, and there, standing in the doorway, was Marcus. But this wasn't the Marcus Peter knew. His friend's face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and hollow. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his expression was empty, devoid of life. "Marcus?" Peter's voice trembled. Marcus didn't respond. He just stared at Peter, his lifeless eyes locked onto him. I thought you were gone," Peter stammered. "What happened to you?" Marcus slowly raised his hand, pointing toward the woods. "It's coming," he whispered. Peter's blood ran cold. He stepped back, shaking his head. What's coming?" "The thing that took me," Marcus replied, his voice barely audible. "It's coming for you next." Peter's mind reeled. Was this real, or was he still dreaming? He didn't know what to believe anymore. But Marcus's words sent a jolt of fear through him. If the figure was coming for him, then there was nowhere to hide. "What do I do?" Peter asked, his voice desperate. Marcus stepped forward, his expression unchanging. "You can't run," he said. "It won't stop until it gets what it wants." Peter backed away, his heart racing. "What does it want?" Marcus's eyes darkened, and his lips curled into a chilling smile. "You." Before Peter could react, Marcus lunged at him, his cold, lifeless hands wrapping around Peter's throat. Peter gasped for air, his vision blurring as the world around him faded into darkness. Peter awoke with a start, lying on the floor of his cabin. His throat was raw and his body ached, but Marcus was gone. Had it been real, or was it just another nightmare? He stumbled to his feet, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and terror. The sun was beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the room. For the first time in weeks, the footsteps outside the cabin had stopped. The figure was gone. But Peter knew it wasn't over. As he stood in the doorway, staring out at the quiet woods, he realized the horrifying truth. The figure wasn't coming for him anymore. It had already taken what it wanted. It had taken him.